it would appear that the use rate of many of the weapon systems is certainly exceeding the current production rate.
Hmm.
And so the supply, the stockpile of those weapons is certainly decreasing at the moment. And so one would, question the sustainability of these kind of operations. Perhaps that's the advantage of asymmetric warfare that Iran is pursuing.
Now, if there is a future conflict that is of much larger scale and of much more magnitude, can the NORAD give anti-missile and anti-drone protection to the region that they operate in?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, we couldn't when I was at NORAD a couple of years ago, but things are changing.
We're seeing divisions within NATO because countries like Spain, France, Italy, and Turkey have officially closed their airspace to US military aircraft that are involved in Operation Epic Fury.
Canada is directly impacted,
Hmm.
not by the supply of oil, but by the price of energy. And so Canada's oil, the price at the pump in Canada has gone up 50% since the start of the conflict.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Christopher Coates again. He was an aviator in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He retired as a lieutenant general after more than 3 decades of service. He was the deputy commander of NORAD and the commander of Canadian Joint Operations. He is currently the director of foreign policy, national defense, and security at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Christopher, welcome back and thank you for speaking to Fair Observer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan. It's great to be here again.
Okay, lots is happening, but I want the Canadian viewpoint. Prime
Mhm.
Minister Mark Carney has declared that the days of spending 70 cents of every defense dollar to the US are over. A, what does that even mean? And B, you've been in NORAD. Is it even physically possible to cut ties with the US? Wouldn't that leave Canada vulnerable?
Hmm. Yeah, so it's an interesting problem that the Prime Minister is trying to solve. And so the Canadian Forces needs a lot of investment to modernize it, to make up for a couple of decades of underinvestment in the military and the many things that changed in the military arts and sciences and capabilities in those decades. And Canada has to catch up. And that's going to require a lot of investment. It would be it would be really difficult for the government to spend that kind of money and have it all go somewhere else. And so it makes sense that the Prime Minister is aiming to try and encourage most of that defense spending to happen in Canada. And so what he has said in the defense industrial strategy was to increase the share of defense acquisitions awarded to Canadian firms to 70%. Well, my view is that the defense investment strategy that says that is far more of a domestic industrial strategy than it is a defense strategy. There is very little in the strategy itself about. It doesn't start with defense needs. It doesn't start with these are the capabilities that we need for the Canadian military, and then these are the ways that we're going to create the industrial base to generate those capabilities. That's not the premise. It's all about creating employment and jobs, Canadian employment and jobs. I would suggest that Canadians care more about jobs and employment right now than they do about defense. Sure, they may care a little bit more about defense than they did a year ago, but fundamentally, Canadians are far more concerned about employment and jobs, and that's what the defense industrial strategy is mostly about. So it's about creating economic benefits for Canada. So your question is, could Canada spend 70% of its defense investment in Canada on Canadian equipment and material? Yeah, I guess presumably it could. It couldn't do that tomorrow. It would take some time to get to that level. Canada has a strong defense industrial base, lots of companies, but most are tier 2 and tier 3. They're suppliers to the big OEMs, the names that you and I would know. The big defense companies in Canada are subsidiaries largely of American companies, Lockheed Martin Canada, Boeing Canada, for example. There are a few Canadian companies that operate in the defense space, some larger ones, but again, they're not providing the kinds of capabilities that Canada is going to have to invest in. So on the one hand, Canada could invest a whole lot of money in the kinds of things that Canadian industry produces, but that might not produce the kind of military we want. Conversely, to try and have the military that I think Canada requires is going to require continuing to spend money elsewhere. But it brings up a couple of other interesting problems then. So if Canada is going to spend money elsewhere, what does that Canada-US relationship look like? Right now, Canada spends about $60 billion a year on defense. About $10 billion-ish is spent on acquisitions, material, equipment, capital procurement. So about 10 billion. Of that 10 billion, and you've used the figure 7 cents on, or 70 cents on the dollar, is spent in the US. Yeah, it's about that. About 60 to 75% is spent in the US. 25 to 40% is spent in Canada, and then a little bit is spent elsewhere. But there's another interesting aspect to that. Canada, under something that was a law that was created in the US in 1956 called the Defense Sharing Production Act, allows Canadian companies to be treated more or less like American companies to bid on US defense material and acquisitions and contracts. The idea was to create a North American defense industrial base. So Canadian firms are largely treated like American firms. Canadian firms are largely exempt from Buy American provisions when it comes to defense. And as a result of that, those Canadian firms that I talked about have about $2 billion worth of business each year into the US. That's about half of all of the production capability of those Canadian firms. So if we look at the defense industrial strategy, it sort of aims to push everybody else out of the Canadian market and say Canadian firms only. So if it's seen as pushing American firms out, it raises the question, how does that affect Canada's access under the Defense Sharing Production Act? Does that in some way jeopardize Canadian firms' access to the American market if Canada is saying, hey, no American firms are far reduced? So I think there'll be a tension that develops over time as this works itself out. My view is that if we were to treat the defense industrial strategy as a stretch objective, as a good target to go for, that would work well as we create over time an effective, functional, strong Canadian defense industry, well integrated with partners, be those in the US or elsewhere. Because we've got to elevate the whole defense industrial base in Canada to get to that point. If it's treated very ideologically or idealistically, that's just going to slow things down at a time when Canada should be looking to increase and accelerate defense spending and transformation. But if we can treat it pragmatically, realistically, then I think it's a good target. If we treat it idealistically, then it's just going to, I think, be some more friction. Second part of your question was, well, what does that say about NORAD? I mean, can we even contemplate a NORAD if we're taking this sort of view of defense acquisition? Yeah, I guess we could. NORAD's binational, Canada, US. If the equipment's built in Canada to the same kind of standards that are required to ensure interoperability with the US, that would work. I don't think it would be more of a struggle for Canada to acquire equipment that wasn't Five Eyes, that didn't allow the introduction of certain communication and other secure kinds of capabilities to be introduced. Certainly, the easiest interoperability results when we're all operating the very same platforms. It's not the only way. Canada operated the CF-18 Hornet as part of its NORAD commitments, but the U.S. wasn't allocating Hornets to the NORAD mission. Nonetheless, we operated well alongside the U.S. I understand it's U.S. built aircraft, but the point being that we don't all have to be flying the very same thing. We just have to be interoperable and be able to integrate. And so, yeah, if we had a Canadian-produced aircraft and other equipment and systems, Sure, but we're decades away from Canada producing its own fighter aircraft, if ever.
Right. So, okay. Then what is Prime Minister Carney hinting at? Is he hinting at a long-term strategy of how you've explained that it's not easy to decouple from what's been built over the decades? And if it has to be done, well, right now, yes, Canadians are thinking emotionally, but they have to think pragmatically, and they have to think long term, because, and the last time we spoke we briefly mentioned about this, is that the Canadian Air Force is looking at the F-35 as the best option to replace the aging F-18 Hornets, but there has been a lot of chatter about it. The F-35 deal is being relooked at, and of course social media is abuzz with mentions of the Gripen, the Saab Gripen from Sweden coming into the Canadian Air Force. You've been a skeptic about the Gripen. You say that the F-35 is the way to go, but how is it looking for the Royal Canadian Air Force in the next 5 to 10 years if this deal doesn't happen?
Yeah, so the minister just, I don't remember whether it was earlier this week or last week, was holding a press conference talking about recruiting in the Canadian Armed Forces. And he got asked the question, where are we on the F-35? And his answer at the time, so earlier this week or last week, was government will announce a decision at the right time. So as you say, still don't have a decision. What does that mean for the Canadian Armed Forces? Well, the longer the decision delays, the more difficult it's going to be for Canada to sustain its fighter force, its force of fighter aircraft. If we consider something, I'll call it the availability profile. So what I'm thinking is the availability of the F-18 and its people and its crews and its weapons. So the availability of that capability over time is going to decrease. It's got an end life. There's a shelf life to the F-18 that has been acknowledged, agreed to, based on the idea that there's going to be a replacement. At the time, the replacement was the F-35 when these plans were made. So, over time, the availability of the F-18, the crews, the aircraft is going to start to decrease. The first F-35s are programmed to be received by the Canadian Forces in Arizona later this year. And so I can only imagine that crews are going to very shortly start to divert from training, and they're going to be taking experienced crews, perhaps some brand new fighter pilots, but some will be coming from the existing fighter force. And that's going to continue on over time. There are going to be fewer F-18s available over time as they start to reach the end of their available service life. And so this is a decision that can be delayed forever. Can it be delayed? Well, I suspect the Air Force will do what it can to reduce the risk. It'll look at all sorts of options to keep reducing the risk. The answer is never a hard answer, but it's becoming more difficult as time goes on, I'm sure.
Right.
I bet if we were in the fighter replacement project at the Royal Canadian Air Force, they'd be appreciative of an earlier decision rather than continuing to wait.
Right. Christopher, I want to shift attention to the war in Iran.
Sure. Yeah.
You've been an aviator, you've been a military man. How have you seen and assessed at least the air campaign over Iran, especially the U.S.-Israeli integrated operations? And you can tell us how you see the strikes, the logistics, the air refueling, the radar, everything that Israel and U.S. did together against Iran.
Yeah, we could talk for a long time on that.
Yeah.
I think I'll just keep it short, though, in the sense that I think that the Israeli and U.S. that they have demonstrated exquisite military capability. And so what's been on display is the finest that sounds like some sort of a judgmental. What I mean is it's the leading in terms of what capabilities air power can generate today. Exquisite capabilities. But we've also seen sort of the value of asymmetric capabilities. against against the U.S., the Israelis, and regional actors. I have questions about the sustainability of the way that that America and Israel have conducted the war. The numbers will be hard to get an exact figure or bottom line on, but it would appear that the use rate of many of the weapon systems is certainly exceeding the current production rate. And so the supply, the stockpile of those weapons is certainly decreasing at the moment. And so one would, question the sustainability of these kind of operations. Perhaps that's the advantage of asymmetric warfare that Iran is pursuing from their side of the conflict. So while on the one hand it gives us a view of the possibility of these advanced capabilities, I think it shows that it's not a completely well understood, defined, refined system of systems yet. There are vulnerabilities. To sustain that system, to keep operating that way, they've had to employ systems in an unsustainable manner. I guess there's the adage about logistics versus operations, and the importance of considering logistics at all times, and that extends today past just whatever is on the flight line or in the magazines, but well back to the industrial capability of the nations that are participating. And it takes a long time to turn on that industrial capability to keep up with the kind of use rates that are occurring now.
Right. Christopher, I want to talk about the asymmetric warfare a little bit more, because what we've seen is that Iran has fired ballistic missiles. They've fired these cheap drones, the Shahed 136 drones. They cost nothing more than $30,000 US. And the United States, they've used interceptor missiles that cost in the millions of dollars to take out these drones. The UAE has... Yes, and the UAE has deployed Apache attack helicopters to take down these drones. Again, using Hellfire missiles, using all sorts of guided rockets. Now, the comparison is immense over here. But what I want you to tell our audience is, we've seen the way Iran's fought and the way they've struck US bases in the Gulf. Now, if there is a future conflict that is of much larger scale and of much more magnitude, can the NORAD give anti-missile and anti-drone protection to the region that they operate in?
Yeah. Well, we couldn't when I was at NORAD a couple of years ago, but things are changing. So NORAD has changed over time. It was created to counter Soviet bombers that dropped gravity bombs. And then it went through a period where it was now trying to counter Soviet bombers that were launching cruise missiles. And then it adapted to systems that adapted systems so that it could deal with the terrorist threat, the 9/11 kind of scenario. And NORAD is in the process of adapting to a new type of warfare with the long-range precision cruise missiles, which is a whole different threat and set. And NORAD is in the process of doing that through the Canadian programs of NORAD modernization, et cetera, that are bringing on over the horizon radars and updating the North Warning System. But none of those are the same kind of threats that are presented by, for instance, the Shahed drones or the Group 1, Group 2 kind of drones and UAVs that were used, like in Spiderweb by Ukraine against Russia. So yeah, NORAD does have some weapon systems that can be used. A cannon, not that accurate. The kinds of air-to-air missiles that you've been talking about, really not. Like if you were to look at the standard operating procedures, there's probably not a good description on how to counter a Shahed drone with the AIM-9 or the AIM-120. So that leaves NORAD at a disadvantage, but they haven't been sitting still. And especially over the last year, there have been some developments. Your listeners may be aware of Joint Interagency Task Force 401 or 410, 401 in the U.S. that's examining new counter UAS, counter drone capabilities. Some of that has been informing NORAD. Some of that has been allowing NORAD to bring new sensors on board, some new common operating pictures. What's really interesting about the counter drone operations, or I'll say fight, in the domestic arena is that it's shared airspace. It's a different problem set than fighting over a battlefield where all of the airspace belongs to military users, and friend and foe is sort of easily established, or more easily established, and it's a capability problem in the homeland, as the expression goes, domestically. That's even more challenging, more difficult, and much of the kind of low-level airspace, it belongs to somebody else, domestic users, and the civil use of the airspace has to be integrated. And so what has happened at NORAD, much like they did after 9/11 and started to integrate the security picture for civil airspace and civil users, is now they've extended into how to counter these low-level threats, the Group 1, Group 2. NORAD can still deal with Group 3, 4, and 5 kinds of the large UAVs or drones, but very small ones, some of those are a law enforcement problem. And so NORAD's been involved in ensuring that the authorities, the coordination are all in place. So there's a common operating picture, if I can use that expression, right? A common view of what's flying through shared technologies that allows NORAD to monitor the airspace when it becomes aware of a track. And they wouldn't know initially whether that track is a drone or an aircraft or even a military aircraft, or perhaps something else, a balloon or a bird. But as that identification takes place, then that track can be determined whether it's hostile or not, or a threat. And then if it's a low-level drone, well, then maybe it's coordination with law enforcement that's in that area that has the tools and the capabilities, the ground-based tools and capabilities to do that. And NORAD is actively in the process of doing that. Just as a sort of a final thought, when I was very involved in NORAD, we were doing things like protection of certain events and activities in Canada, a G20 summit, in the US, the Super Bowl, for example, and there are temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs, established around those activities, and NORAD would be one of the lead agencies for protecting that airspace. And that's still occurring now today, but with a much more active counter drone or counter UAS element to it. So yeah, they're moving forward. It's not the traditional NORAD weapon sets or the traditional NORAD sensors, but there are new capabilities being brought online and integrated. And I think the integrated is the interesting part of that, because they don't even have to belong to NORAD per se, but NORAD is a bit of an orchestrator to coordinate those activities and make sure that the right decisions are being made and the right actions taken.
Well, Christopher, when we talk about the war in Iran, tactically for the US and Israel, it has been brilliant because they've shown how, I mean, they're arguably two of the best air forces in the world. They've flown almost 10,000 sorties, or probably even more, in a span of just 41 days, and they've flown in hostile territory, and they've delivered well. So tactically, it's been brilliant for them. Of course, yeah, when you strike, you're going to get struck back, and Iran did exactly that with their missiles and drones. And of course, there were hits and losses on Israel, for Israel and for the US. But when you look at things strategically, the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, it stands still. It stands tall. Yes, senior leadership has been killed, but they've been replaced. White beards have been removed and black beards have come in. They're now more ideologically charged. They're younger. They have more testosterone. They're willing to take more risks. So Iran is putting up a good fight. And what's worrying is that we're seeing divisions within NATO because countries like Spain, France, Italy, and Turkey have officially closed their airspace to US military aircraft that are involved in Operation Epic Fury. Now, two questions come in mind. Has this ever happened before in NATO's history? And second, is this the beginning of the end of NATO?
Um, so two good questions. If this is the beginning of the end of NATO, and if it is, it's not the closing of the airspace that's the the one and only contributor to realizing that. If we were to look back in 20 years and say, oh yeah, that was the beginning of the end of NATO, we would see some other things that were occurring. Right? There's
Right.
disagreements over the Ukraine war. There's burden sharing disputes, there's U.S. unilateral actions, there's trade tensions. There are a whole bunch of things that are happening right now. And there's the closure of some airspace by a few NATO nations. And so I think that NATO is going through some tensions and some disruptions and some challenges as it has to evolve to a world that is in transition. And it's done that before and come out stronger. And so, I wouldn't close that chapter yet and say, all right, sayonara, it's all over for NATO. I would, and to your second question, I'll come back to that, but to your second question, yeah, it has happened before. In the Libya conflict, airspace was closed by the same three nations. Turkey was also involved. Now wasn't involved in the Libya closures, and so I think that this is more about diplomatic signaling than NATO signaling. This is not NATO nations saying we're as a NATO members we're closing our airspace. It's not a NATO thing. It's we, for our domestic reasons and our view of what's going on, are closing our airspace. It's diplomatic signaling. And so it has happened before, and NATO survived that. People at the time weren't talking about the end of NATO when it occurred before. And I realize there's a lot of chatter now, but there are more things going on. And so I think this would be looked at as a data point and not an entire story. As the historians look back on this several years from now, but to some degree, you're asking me to predict the future. The way I'd predict it is that NATO remains strong and gets through this. And so I think it's an interesting question to ask, but I think it has take it in a bigger context. It's not necessarily a sign that NATO no longer has a future.
Right. Now, Christopher, I'm speaking to you from India, a country that is much closer geographically to the Strait of Hormuz, and you're in Canada, in Ottawa. Of course, Canada is not affected directly by this because of this conflict, because as we're speaking today is the 24th of April, the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Now, Canada has low dependency on the strait, unlike India, where India gets almost 20 to 30% of its oil from the strait and 80% of its LPG for food from the strait. So yes, India is being affected. Canada is not really being affected, yet we see Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney making a lot of statements. He's been calling on the countries involved in the war to come to the negotiating table. He's called for the US, Israel, and Iran to stick to international law. Can we expect Canada to play a greater role in this region going forward?
Canada is directly impacted, not by the supply of oil, but by the price of energy. And so Canada's oil, the price at the pump in Canada has gone up 50% since the start of the conflict. While we're unlikely as a net exporter of petroleum to be affected by shortages, and so I know those are affecting some parts of the world, some countries that are importers. As a net exporter, we won't be affected, but we are directly affected economically by what's happening with the closure of the strait. And so there is a vested interest for Canada. Unfortunately, I don't expect that you'll see Canada being able to do lots. Our military doesn't have the kinds of capabilities that are going to be directly applicable during the conflict. We just talked about F-35s and CF-18s, and it wouldn't be a conflict that I'd want to see a CF-18 getting involved in with its current capabilities. Canada doesn't have the kinds of maritime mass or capabilities that would be very effective or useful to reopen the strait, for example, at the moment. But I'm sure that the Canadian military authorities are looking at what could we do on the ground to support our regional allies. Are there capabilities that would be of interest? So I'm pretty confident those kinds of discussions are ongoing, and they'll be looking for the diplomatic on-ramps where those make sense. Canada, it would have been nice if we'd been in a position to be able to have an impact on energy flows. Canada has enormous capacity from an energy perspective, but unfortunately, the way our energy distribution system is established, we're unable to get these reserves out to allies, to India and others in the kind of quantity that would make a difference to help balance things or to offset the restrictions that have taken place. So Canada could have. It is possible. All of those ships that are now streaming to Texas for increased oil supply could have been coming to Canada, but much of that crude that's being pumped out of Texas has come from Canadian sources through pipelines that lead into the U.S. rather than through Canadian refineries or Canadian pipelines that go to Tidewater in Canada. Again, that's just the way that Canada has, unfortunately, chose to pursue its energy policies. In terms of sort of a middle power, I think what's happened in this conflict has perhaps highlighted some of the limitations of the idea of middle powers getting together for greater impact. Perhaps, Pakistan has had some impact during this period, but that's more due, I would say, to historical pragmatic relationship that Pakistan has had with Iran, rather than in the U.S., rather than some sort of middle power gymnastics that Pakistan has been able to execute or undertake. It's a historical thing, not a newfound middle power capability. So I'd be really interested if you thought there was some particular opportunity for Canada with its middle power flag to achieve some sort of make a difference on in what's happening in the region. It's really difficult. That's not the way geopolitics works.
Absolutely, but I do see Canada probably forming a coalition with other middle powers. It could involve the UK, it could involve Japan, probably India, even try and get Pakistan on that same table. No, despite knowing that it's going to be almost impossible, but there could be some sort of coalition that could probably work and try and see if things can be ironed out and the Strait of Hormuz is open again. But do you see that happening at all, or do you think that's not possible?
I would be really surprised. If for Canada to do that, for any nation to do that, the lead nation in the development of a coalition like that has to come with normally preponderance of assets or resources. Traditionally, that's how it works. They just don't come with the preponderance of good ideas. They have to come with some resources that matter and make a difference. And that, I think, would be difficult for Canada in the circumstances to do that. It would be, I don't disagree that that's a worthwhile objective. It's a good place for Canada to want to be. But those aren't the objectives that this country has established for itself over the last generation, the last decade. It's not the role that Canada saw, so we're not ready to be able to do that, in my view. We've been a good contributing nation. We've jumped on other people's coalitions and tried to contribute where we could. But to be in a position to assemble and lead a coalition like that, we got all the good ideas, but it takes more than that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christopher. It's a pleasure speaking to you as always.
All right. Thanks, Ron.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.